So our news review begins with, well, could it be the international story of the weekend? Myanmar's landmark election. Let's get the New York Times, the international New York Times, the front page with a photo showing a jubilant scene outside Aung San Suu Kyi's opposition party headquarters in Yangon.
Yeah, well, the Gulf News has the headline, "The Egypt crash is a game changer," as the chief of the airline, Emirates, expects a global course for tighter aviation security.
The FT leads on Saudi Arabia's oil policy. It says the country is determined to continue pumping enough oil to protect its global market share.
The Wall Street Journal covers Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's defeat in some important state elections.
The business pages of the South China Morning Post here reporting a slump in foreign investment in China's mining sector. In fact, its lowest in over a decade.
Wowzers. And the Time focuses on Europe. It's reporting that the British Prime Minister might be prepared to hold the referendum on Britain's membership of the EU in June if other leaders agree to the bulk of his proposed reforms.
A continuing story that's going to be. Rolake Akinkugbe is here, Head of Energy and Natural Resource at FBN Capital. And you're flying back to Nigeria, so thank you very much.
Yeah, have you seen the suitcases out in the green room?
I have.
There's about 20 of them.
Good morning. Good to see you both. Good to see you both.
Rolake, the whole world, it seems, has been wooing Myanmar for the past few years since these reforms began. And yet John Kerry has said, look, this wasn't perfect. Just one example, Rohingya Muslims, they're not given citizenship. They haven't been allowed to vote. But what's your take on Myanmar at the moment?
I mean, notwithstanding all the teething problems, we've seen somewhat greater political freedoms in Myanmar over the last 5 years. So this election is quite significant for that very reason. But you still have these very deep-seated divisions in the country with the Buddhist extremists, the anti-Muslim lobby in the country, as well as ethnic minorities. So it's a lot more complex than just victory for Aung San Suu Kyi. So I think, you know, the coming days will be very telling, particularly because the military junta still controls at least 25% of parliamentary seats and will have to control that. Wow. Yeah.
What's the potential of Myanmar's economy? I mean, a lot of minerals, right?
A lot of minerals, gems, cheap labour, which is attractive from
50-odd million people population. 50-odd million,
and also located quite close to Malaysia and Thailand, and so important gateway in terms of trade in that South Asian region.
Indeed. Yeah. Let's turn our attention to the Gulf News. Mr. Tim Clark, Sir Tim Clark, the big boss, one of the founding fathers of Emirates Airlines, has come out and said, look, this Egypt crash, a game changer, he says. But I think his concern is, and I know Tim through the aviation industry, his concern is that, look, the industry actually needs to get together and talk about this because they're worried that the government, US, etc., EU, will put in sort of knee-jerk reaction security enforcement.
Yeah, and I quite agree with him, but if you look back over the last years, there have actually been several game-changing moments for aviation, both in terms of safety as well as security. We saw with the German wings, the Malaysian air crashes as well. So I think there's going to be a need to think along the lines of greater regional cooperation, and particularly security at airports. So whilst you may have a national carrier flying to a Western destination, if you're coming from some countries which have a history of terrorism or extremism, then you also want to go further and ensure monitoring of security checks at the point of departure. And I think that would be quite a significant move, if you can agree on that.
And we certainly last week, right, we heard from many Brits who had returned from Sharm el-Sheikh, those who got out just before the suspension of flights, who were saying, look, the security is nothing. I mean, no, hang on, let me rephrase that. Not nothing, but nothing compared to
what
we have in Britain and the rest of the West. And you think, you know, we looked at the Egyptian economy on Friday, the hit that it'll take from this. And I was asking the question, you think, you know, if the Egyptians realise, you know, really how important tourism is for their economy, that they would be throwing everything they can at this.
There may have been some lapses there. The investigation's not fully complete, but if it is fully confirmed, and I think they would really have to rethink airport security.
Yeah, let's note importantly, no bomb fragments have been found in any of the wreckage, so it's not proven yet, despite what the Americans and the British are saying that it's most probably a bomb. And you know, the guys at the airport are being intensely.
They've heard a noise.
They heard a noise right in the last few seconds of the recording.
To see what happens. Okay, is this one of your specialities, Saudi oil? You know.
Well, it has to be, even if I'm not covering Saudi directly, just because of the significance of Saudi production to the global oil market and its influence within the OPEC body. Now, the Saudis are saying they will keep pumping oil despite the downward trends in oil prices we've seen. I mean, I think it's quite significant. OPEC has abandoned this price targeting policy, and the Saudis remain concerned about market share. And their thinking is that Asian demand is still resilient. And by 2017, demand would have picked up in response to the oil price. So, I mean, this policy is quite interesting because there's no consensus within OPEC come December 4. I think the policy which they maintained in November last year will stay, but I think it's quite a difficult position for other countries that perhaps can't dip into the reserves base that the Saudis have.
That's interesting to say that, because the Saudis have been dipping into their sovereign wealth fund, right? This is their big, the country's big investment arm, if you will. That a lot of money was being pumped into that. They're actually taking a lot of this money out and putting it into the economy, keeping people happy.
Keeping people, but it hasn't been plain sailing for them. They've had to cut back on large-scale infrastructure spending. They're facing pressure from the IMF to cut back public spending, and public debt as a percentage of GDP is now at 20%. And how sustainable that is going to be.
Well, how long can they do this? How long do you think the Saudi government can say, look, we're not going to change?
Some analysts think they can go for a pretty long while.
Wow.
Yeah.
You're from Nigeria, one of the world's most important oil-producing countries. What effects do you see back home with this reduction in price?
Of course, because, for instance, it's had an impact on the Nigerian exchange rate, which relative to the dollar has been a real problem. We're seeing the depreciation in the naira, which is a local currency. And government reserves have tumbled by, revenues have tumbled by more than 40% since this trend began. So it's a real concern. And one would think that come December, the views of some of the other member countries will also be taken into account.
Incredible. I didn't realise it was 40%.
Yeah. Well, if you think about it, right? Well, we've seen oil price by 50% cut. So, but just very briefly, do you think, just in a nutshell, do you think it is a? I mean, yes, demand has gone down around the world, but do you think it is a US fracking story?
It is. Technology in the US has been a game changer, but it's also been a demand story. We focus so much on the supply side with this abundant supply, but look at what's happening in Asia and China and India. Those economies are facing their own domestic headwinds.
You go. The Wall Street Journal,
well, okay. Narendra Modi looks as if he's going to lose his BJP party, at least the election in Bihar, an important eastern state. Overall, in terms of his big business policies, because that's one of the things that we've looked at very closely since he became the Prime
rapid
Minister.
development. He promised
absolutely.
rapid development, didn't he?
How might this affect his overall policies?
Yeah, well, I mean, this to me is a classic case of over-promising and under-delivering. And he was focused on winning the majority in the Bihar state, which is 100 million people, where reforms were needed, where poverty is a huge problem. And unfortunately, he failed to do so. He's been trying to garner a lot of international support for his domestic reforms, but doesn't seem to have achieved that. So it's a major issue forward, and there'll be some who think focus on the domestic situation and stimulating the economy and making sure that you can support Indian exports globally. And I think that should be a policy priority, because this is quite a significant wake-up call for the BJP going forward.
Just quickly moving on to the South China Morning Post. And perhaps no surprises with this story. We've seen investment in the industry you cover, oil industry, for example. We've seen that investment, billions and billions, being either shelved or totally scrapped altogether because of the low oil prices. We've also got low, other commodities as well, iron ore, etc. They're fallen off a cliff, their prices, and lo and behold, we're seeing less investment in the mining industry, and this one is in China's mining industry.
Yeah, this is in China's mining industry. It's not a surprise what has happened with global commodity prices, but what is particularly interesting here, there are cheaper assets for investors to look at elsewhere. So if you have an economy where regulation is a bit stringent for mining investors coming in, anyone would look at snapping up assets elsewhere where the policy environment may be more favorable to investment. And the Chinese economy has suffered industrial decline. It's something that's affecting global demand. So there's a real need to stimulate investment locally, and that's something that the government is going to need to think seriously about. But it's not totally surprising. We're seeing many commodity-strong countries face a decline in FDI that's coming in. I mean, we saw $300 million last year went into China FDI. Compare that to China's investment elsewhere, which is $6 billion, and you've always had that imbalance, naturally. But this is particularly interesting because of the global commodity cycle.
So we've got just under a minute left to go. It says in the Times that David Cameron called this referendum about in-out, to simplify it, as far as EU membership is concerned, as early as June. You know, one thing that occurred to me as one of the most significant possible factors, the US saying recently we won't be able to do individual deals with the UK if it leaves the EU. Other people have said that's a scaremongering. Give us your take.
For me, what I think is the strategy here is very interesting. Essentially, what David Cameron is saying, it's like going to your employers and threatening to quit in the hope of a better salary. Now, the problem is if you don't have a real good backup plan, that may backfire. And I think the UK needs to think about what this will mean in terms of the broader global context and whether the timing of the referendum is the best thing.
Bam, right on time. Look at that.
I was about to say,
You got it.
have a great flight back home.
Safe
Thank you
journey.
very much indeed.
Good to see you. Thanks.
Bye-bye. Bye.